So, welcome to the talk on how to image a meteor shower. As Ness mentioned, the Perseids are one of the most spectacular of the year. They'll be coming up here in a couple weeks. Now, things that we're going to talk about in this lecture are applicable to really any meteor shower. So, there's a variety of them throughout the year that this will be applicable to. A little bit about myself. As Ness mentioned, I do run the Deep Sky Ohio page. This was a page that was created specifically for people wanting to see my images from the astronomy park, and I didn't want to overwhelm Brad with a bunch of images, especially ones that were not relevant to JGAP. You can see that since my early rig, it has changed quite a bit. I also play guitar, which is one of the main reasons why we did move this. I did have a gig next weekend. Of course, COVID has been wreaking havoc with my music schedule, so there's that. As far as the agenda for this discussion, very first thing we need to talk about is going to be the equipment that we are going to be using. Once we have established what gear we're going to have, what we can work with, we'll talk about finding a location, how to set it up, and talk about the camera settings. And then what are you going to do with the data when you get it? So when you talk about standard photography, most people are just talking about images. With astrophotography and nighttime photography, you'll typically hear something more along the lines of data, because at the end of the day, that's what we're really capturing. And please let me know, Ness, or anybody on the Zoom session, if my audio is cutting in and out. Hopefully we are good and have a good solid connection. So without further ado, let's start. The first thing that we need to pick when we're actually going to image something is our camera. Now, the nice thing about meteor showers is you can't predict where they're going to be, right? The Neowise comet was and still is visible with telescopes and was visible with the naked eye in the past few weeks and months. That is an object. While moving, it's moving very, very slow, which means we can point a telescope. We can get really close to it. Meteors are going to be in a fraction of a second burst through the sky. What makes these, particularly the Perseid meteor showers, that is coming from the constellation Perseus. So that's going to be our center point, and it will radiate out. So now that we know what we're actually going to try to do here, we need to figure out what camera we can use. You can get away with a standard point and shoot like this, as long as you have a very wide field of view. Some of these cameras do have fisheye lenses that you can attach, and you can even adjust exposure, gain, a lot of things that we'll talk about later. A preferred camera is going to be these two on the right. This one in the center should look pretty familiar. It's a DSLR. This can be Canon or Nikon, or any of the other brands. Canon and Nikon are, of course, the two most popular. And then the one at the far right might look a little odd. That is a dedicated astronomy camera. So the main difference between these two would be that possibly the sensor size is different. There's typically not going to be a infrared filter on it. So one of the cool things about meteors is that really you're imaging the sky and you're hoping to catch a meteor. So one of the things that I'm planning on doing is doing my typical deep sky stuff really wide, and then seeing which images have a meteor in it. So that means I want to capture some data that you might not find in a stock DSLR. So these are really the options we're going to start with, right? Now, the next step is finding what your lens is going to be. I mentioned that it's going to be radiating out from Perseus. This is going to be pretty much across the sky for the majority of the sky, other than complete opposition of Perseus. So here's an example of different lenses with different focal lengths. Now, the one that we want is going to be the one that gives us the most amount of field of view. So if you have, for example, in this image, a meteorite over here, or a meteor over here, If you're using a 300 millimeter lens, you're not going to be able to see. It's going to be completely cut off, and as you get larger and larger, it's going to get even worse, right? So the trick is to get it as wide as you can. If you're really wanting to capture everything all at once, you can use a fisheye lens and go from horizon to horizon. That is going to distort your image a bit, which we'll also talk about. So my recommendation for a lens is anywhere between maybe a 8 or 10 millimeter and a 14 millimeter lens. I myself will be using a 14 millimeter Rokinon. The next thing we want to talk about, so let's say we picked our lens, right? We're going to have a camera, we got our lens. Like I said, anywhere between 8 and 14 is pretty good. Now we need to talk about exposure. So exposure is going to be how much light our sensor is going to be able to detect, and how much of that light is going to be saved as data. So keep in mind, we're talking mostly digital here. We won't be talking about film in this talk. But for the most part, a lot of the stuff will still be relevant, right? So there's three aspects to an exposure. There's the aperture, which is our depth of field, our shutter speed, how long we're going to hold the shutter open to gather light, and then gain or ISO. What this is going to do is increase the signal as light hits it. If it's very faint, the gain will boost it, so you'll actually be able to see it more. Now, each one of these, as you increase these particular settings, are going to have potentially negative side effects that we'll talk about. And you can see here we've got aperture, the depth of field will increase, motion blur will increase with shutter speed, and of course, with the increased gain, we will see additional noise. Now with that, so the first thing we're going to talk about is the aperture. What aperture should we use? The wider the aperture, the more light we're going to gather. But if we go too wide, depending on your lens, we'll experience two types of things. The first thing is called coma. And effectively what is happening is the light is coming in on this lens and it is bending. And because the lens is curved, it's going to be bending at different spots. And we'll see here, this is in the Pleiades. With a wide open aperture, we're seeing it start to bend a little bit. We're seeing it stretch. If we lower or increase the aperture a little bit, this is what's called an f-stop, which is the focal ratio with the combination of the aperture and the focal length, we can see that the star sharpens up, right? Because that means all this light that's being heavily bent here is now being shrunk more towards the center of the lens. Now, in a good lens with good optics, this is just the main thing you need to worry about. Rokinons are really good. There's some really high dollar lenses that are pretty good with maintaining the color as light is bending through the lens, so you just have to worry about coma. Chromatic aberration, though, you'll especially notice this with cheaper lenses, with cheaper glass, is very similar, but what's happening is instead of all the light coming through and bending, it's bending the light from the electromagnetic spectrum, it's bending them at different wavelengths. And what you can see here in this image gives you an example of both coma and chromatic aberration, because chances are, if you have chromatic aberration, you're also going to have coma. You can see that we get these blue halos. So this is something, again, if we lower our f-stop, or increase our f-stop, I should say, or shrinking our aperture, we can start to mitigate this. I typically, my Rokinon 14 is an f2. I will typically image at about f3, f3.5 to avoid these kinds of things. Next, we want to choose our exposure time. Now, the exposure, this is where art kind of meets science, because some people want to see star trails. And that's something else you have to think about when you start planning your image, right? You want to know not just how you want your meteors to look and where to get them, but you also want to know what you want your background to look like. So the rule of thumb, if you want sharp stars, is 500 divided by the focal length, right? So if we have a 50 millimeter lens, that'll be about a 10-second exposure on the night sky before we start to see star trails. And as you increase as you decrease your focal length, this will go up. So the 14 millimeter lens that we're using in our example here, I should be able to get about 30 seconds without too much star trail, right? Now, as you're increasing your exposure time, you're also going to be increasing the amount of light hitting the sensor. So there's going to be a little bit of a balancing act. If you want to get these star trails, as you see in this 25-minute exposure, you're going to want to possibly lower your gain, or you're going to want to lower your aperture even more, because again, you can see how the night sky is actually brightening up as this is increased. So it's definitely going to be a balancing act between these three things. The final setting in our triangle is the ISO, or gain. Again, this is effectively when the light hits the sensor, it determines how much of that light is going to be, or the intensity of that light or signal. So this is an example of a ISO 1600, 32, and 64. And you can see that this particular imaging session, they decreased the exposure time, but they increased the gain. So the intensity doesn't really change between the two, but we do see noise, because as the gain increases, the pixels that are not getting light are warming up. And as it warms up, it's going to create noise. We'll also see this a little bit as you hold the sensor open, because more electrical current's coming through, but it's really noticeable with gain. And with a color camera like a Canon, you will see a lot of color noise. So you see these reds, blues, and greens from the Bayer matrix on the camera. Now with a astronomical camera, whether it be color or monochrome, most manufacturers will post gain settings, and most of them really focus on lowering the noise while maximizing the amount of gain. So this is an example of my ASI 294 MC Pro. Oops, go back one. And you can see the gain is actually improved, or the noise is improved at a gain of a little bit past 120. That's called unity gain for this particular camera. Every camera is going to be a little bit different. If you have an astronomical camera, you'll want to just read up and see what that is. There's additional things to consider with this as well with most astronomical cameras, such as color detail and contrast between your lights and your darks. But the main point of this is to, of course, make sure that you understand as you increase gain, you're adding noise to your image. And as with all astrophotography, the goal is to maximize signal while minimizing the noise. The less noise you have to worry about, the clearer your image will be. So what else do we need with our gear? We have our camera, we have our lens. What else? Tripod is going to be a must. If you are going to be taking anything longer than half a second, you're not going to be able to hold this thing still enough. Just breathing is going to cause the image to appear shaky. So you want to get a tripod. If you're just using a tripod, like I said, you're going to be looking for under 30 seconds roughly for your exposure times. And since we don't know where these meteors are going to be, you're going to have to take lots of these 30-second images, which is why it's nice to have something like your remote shutter. Most remote shutters can be programmed to take a number of images for duration and have delays and things like that. So you can kind of just set it and forget it and let the night go and enjoy the night sky. If you don't have a remote shutter, you can connect your camera to computers using software. I've listed a couple here. There are definitely more out there, but the main ones that I've used is Astrophotography Tool and SharpCap. Astrophotography Tool, I want to say is like 80 bucks or something like that. It's been a while since I bought it. There's another one called Backyard EOS for Canon. And even some newer Canons have remote control software that lets you control it from a laptop. Again, this is just convenience. It's not 100% required, but it is a nice to have. If you don't have either one of those two things, you can get away with a burst shot and a timer. So most cameras, even the point and shoot ones, if you have a tripod, there's usually a setting for like 2, 5, 10-second delays before the camera starts to take pictures. And there's usually a setting for burst shots. So you pick your exposure time, your aperture, and your gain, set the delay, and set the number of shots you want to take and let it go. The delay is because when you push your shutter button, typically, when you let go of it, it's going to typically shake the tripod. So by putting the delay in there, you can initiate the release of the shutter without actually touching it. So again, if you're strapped for cash and you don't have a lot of gear, like I said, get a tripod, your point and shoot, and then using that setting, you can still get images. Just keep in mind, most burst shots aren't going to do more than 10, and throughout the course of a night, you'll probably be having to go back and click that over and over again. The bad thing about that is, as we mentioned, meteors are going to be fractions of a second. So while it takes you maybe 1 or 2 seconds to hit that button, you could potentially miss a meteor. Other things are really, really nice to have, especially this time of year, dew heaters. As it cools off in the night, dew will accumulate, and there's nothing worse than taking your images back and seeing them look really great and then slowly fade and fade and fade until it's gray. This happens to me on occasion, so I have tons of dew heaters now. You can get a USB dew heater from Amazon for 20 bucks. Highly recommend it. Great for lenses. You can also use a sock and some hand warmers, pantyhose, whatever you have to. You effectively want to warm the air around the lens. Now, you can see off to the side here, this is my rig that I will be using. I have it slightly behind the camera lens. You usually will get better results if you warm the air within the lens as opposed to outside, because you won't be losing as much energy. If you stick it too far outside, all that energy is going to escape into the atmosphere, and you're not powering the atmosphere with a 5 amp USB. So just keep that in mind. Again, this is worth the investment, especially if you plan on being out all night. Other things, star charts are great. Cell phones these days, you can get Stellarium for free on your cell phone. There's, I think iPhone has one. I can't recall what it is off the top of my head, but there's a dozen. There's a Google Sky Maps. Just, download it. Most of them work offline if you're in a really remote location, but it's good if you're not that familiar with your constellation, so you can find, okay, there's Perseus. Where do I want to point within the sky? And the final thing, which is a luxury item for this case, is a star tracker. In my rig, I am using the Ioptron Skyguider Pro. It's effectively an equatorial mount that I can put my camera on, and it will track the sky relatively easily. It's not, one of the really nice mounts like I have with my CEM60, but it gets the job done, especially at these wide apertures. So what I'm also using here, I mentioned APT and SharpCap. I'm actually using what's called an ASI Air. So effectively what this does, it's a Raspberry Pi that runs some software that I connect with a phone or tablet, and I can control and see my images through that as opposed to carrying a laptop around. I love these things. If you're really getting into astrophotography, definitely recommend the ASI Air. But this is a pretty simple rig. It will all fit in a backpack. I actually took this exact rig to Hawaii. And so if you're just getting into astrophotography, definitely recommend this. The whole setup is less than a very expensive telescope. And with the wide field of view, it will definitely help figure out where things are, along with being able to capture the most amount of meteor showers in a night. One thing to make mention of, we mentioned that the Perseids are coming up. We will be able to see Perseid meteor showers, in the coming weeks. It just so happens that the 11th and 12th will happen to be the best. to give you an idea of how many meteors you're looking at, last year's was, I believe, 10 to 15 meteors per hour. So it's not going to look like it's raining if you're expecting that. And we'll talk a little about why some images do look like that. But as far as why we have to take these extreme measures to take all these images, like I said, we don't know where they're going to be at. They're going to be random times and 10 to 15 an hour. And that's just based on last year. It could be more, it could be less. All right. So we've got our rig. The next thing we need to figure out, where are we going to image? You can try to do it from your backyard, but if you are in Delaware like I am, or even worse skies like the center of Columbus, you may want to move your setup to a darker sky. Why would we want to do this? Well, light pollution. So even though meteors are typically going to be pretty bright, some of the fainter ones will not be visible. So you'll only be able to see out of those 10 to 15 an hour, maybe one or two. And those could be anywhere in the sky. Last year, I just did observing. I didn't actually image it, but a lot of my friends and family were like, well, we were out, we didn't see anything. Well, they were under a light dome. So you can see this is a shot of the Elephant Trunk Nebula under Bortle class 5, 4, and 3. Same setting, same exposure, and we can see much more detail in the Bortle class 3. John Glenn Astronomy Park is somewhere in between these two, so it's very dark skies, good spot to observe and also safely. I know there are a couple of friends that I have that have gone out onto highways or off the side of a road. Don't recommend doing that. Cars do not typically see astronomical gear at night. So you'll have to keep that in mind. Now, there are things that you can do if you can't get out there. There are light pollution filters that you can buy. There's clip-in ones for DSLRs. There's some that screw on the end of a camera. You know, things like that that can help mitigate that, but it's always going to be better to find some darker skies. So I want to jump out of the presentation for a second, because the next thing we want to do is figure out how do we want to frame this session. So I typically, and I'll do this for multiple things, not just, I'll do this with planets, I'll do this with deep sky objects, and of course meteors, using Stellarium. This is, again, a free software. Let's go to the night of the 11th. And we'll go one more hour. So this will be the night of the 11th, around 10:30. Actually, let's go a little bit longer than that. Let's do midnight, 30 minutes after midnight or so. So in Stellarium, we can see these objects here. These are all different meteor showers. The best one is, of course, going to be this one over here in the constellation Perseus. And we can turn on a couple things here. So this is where they're going to radiate from. If you point in this section, you probably won't get a whole lot of meteors, right? Because they're going to be radiating outward. So you typically want to image off to the side. And another thing that I love about Stellarium is I have a list of different things to see what my focal length is and my field of view will be with my particular cameras. So if I do, let's see, I think this is let's do the 35. So this is an example of a 35 millimeter lens. We can change this up a bit. So this is the field of view with the ZWO, and for some reason it did not save my Canon image. So Canon is actually going to be slightly larger than my ZWO. But we can also, real quick, if I go edit here, telescopes. Even though these are lenses, it's still a telescope, basically. Let's change the focal length to 14, and this should be 45. And let's go right here. So this is about what you can see with a 14 millimeter lens. And again, this is with the ZWO camera sensor, so it's a little bit smaller. It'll come out a little bit longer and wider for the Canon sensor because it's an APC. And if you have full frame, it'll be even wider than this. But you can see we get a nice chunk of the sky. And something I've been doing over the past couple of days, just playing with different areas of the sky. Where do I want to image? Do I want to image this way with Polaris? I would do this maybe if I was doing star trails, so that way I can see the Earth's rotation here. A little bit of the Milky Way, but there's really not that much in this area that's that interesting. What I'm probably going to do is come over here because we have a lot of cool things happening. We've got a little bit of the Milky Way still. We've got the Andromeda Galaxy, which will be visible in a 14 millimeter focal length. Triangulum might be a little bit faint. We'll see what we can get. And then we've also got some pretty interesting nebulae over here as well, the Heart and Soul Nebula. So what my plan is, take long exposures, try to actually image the objects that aren't moving, and then find which of my frames have meteors in them. So that's some of the things you want to think about. You also want to think, maybe you want to have some foreground in here at J-Gap, for example. If you want to get the plaza, maybe you want to image a little bit lower. But this gives you an idea of time. It also gives you, let's use this one, an idea of how high it's going to be off the horizon. Obviously, you want to image as high up as you possibly can. That's one of the reasons why I boosted this from 10:30 to midnight, so we can see it higher up in the sky. So again, great tool. Lots of other stuff you can do. Again, I turn on my deep sky objects so I can see, what other things can I get in the image to make it interesting. Again, kind of mashing up art and science. Another cool thing with this particular image that I'm just now realizing is we'll actually be able to see Mars in this field of view as well. So that'd be pretty cool. We can get Andromeda, Mars, and meteors as they come through the night sky. So let's go back to the presentation. So next I want to talk about processing the data. So let's say we're on the next day. You're going to be very tired and you just need a lot of coffee to continue going through the process. So we got our rig, we went out, we captured, we got what we wanted. Now we need to figure out what we're going to do with that data. There's some things that we need to know as we're looking through our data. Is it actually a meteor? So can anyone on the Zoom session tell me which one of these is actually a meteor? You can unmute yourself if needed. I know Brad's got this.
On the right.
You think this one's a meteor?
That's a satellite flare.
Yeah, so the first one is just a typical satellite. This is pretty easily noticeable because it's going to be a little bit of a curved line. It's going to have no definition to it. It's just going to be a completely straight line across the sky. The second one's actually the meteor. And the reason for that is because we can see multiple colors and we can see this flash of light. Most meteors, as they're entering, are going to heat up at a very high rate, and many of them will actually explode. We'll talk about colors in the next slide, but that is the dead giveaway for this. Now, this one is a bit tricky because we see it's got a little bit of a tail here, but we don't see any color, and we see more of a line on this side of the object. So, as Brad said, it is a flare. If we were around last year or a few years before, you would see something called iridium flares. The last iridium satellite was decommissioned in December. These are actually meteorological satellites. They're going to be flaring right now. But these, you will see these most likely in your images over the course of a night. So these are things we may or may not want. The other thing is they will not be in the same direction as the meteors typically. Typically they're going to be, perpendicular, or they'll be moving in the wrong direction, especially if you're imaging the Perseid meteor shower. So keep that in mind. What you think might be a meteor may not actually be one. So definitely look for something like this. Now here's a close-up of a Perseid meteor. Meteors are going to have more color to them than your typical satellite, and that's because of the elements they're made of. So as they're entering the atmosphere, those elements are going to, again, heat up, they'll glow, and then they will emit light. Perseid meteors are going to primarily be composed of calcium and magnesium. So we get this nice pink and green color as it enters our atmosphere. So now we know what we look for in our images after actually capturing them. Things that we're going to want to use to process this data now. Obviously, you could just take your image and post it to Facebook if you like. But if you want to take it a step further, one, you want to be imaging in RAW and not just JPEG. That way you get all of the data without the camera performing any sort of color calibration or stretching of the image, which is what they typically do, especially in preview mode. So if you're shooting in RAW, you typically won't see much data until you start to edit it. These are most of the programs that I use. Lightroom is really great for calibrating your data right out of the camera. That way they're all going to start at the same point. As the night moves on, you're going to notice that the images will typically get clearer and darker as they move up towards the zenith. Whereas if they're closer to the horizon, they're going to be not as crisp. Deep Sky Stacker is a free software, very great for stacking your images. It'll align the stars if you are doing some tracked nighttime photography, and that'll allow you to increase your signal to noise ratio. It also allows you to add darks and flats, which are calibration frames. Dark frames are going to be used, basically you take a picture of the noise by covering up your camera lens, taking the same exposure, same gain, and then something like Deep Sky Stacker will average that out from the image, leaving you with a clearer image while using a higher gain. And then flats would be used to get rid of any vignetting that you may find in your image. Adobe Photoshop, we'll actually be using that in our demo of how to process these shortly. Very, very good program. It is not free. I think right now it is $10 a month if you want to use that. An alternative to Photoshop that's free is GIMP. Not quite as powerful, but may still be useful in editing your photos. If you want to do star trails, I typically use Star Stacks. Star Stacks is really great for taking those long exposures and then putting them all together. So if you see an image like this from my backyard, I didn't take one big long image. I took a lot of smaller ones, and what it does is stitch them together. Now, in this image, we can, if you had meteors in them, you'd be able to see them, but they're going to probably be pretty faint because this highlights and enhances the stars. So you can see we've got a satellite and we've got planes. These are these dots going through the image. They're pretty faint, so I wouldn't just stop here with your meteors, but it will be useful in getting those star trails if that's what you're going for. And then let me get back to my slide here. The last one is, again, very similar to this SkyGuider Ioptron, or the Ioptron SkyGuider Pro. PixInsight it's not needed, but if you're doing deep sky stuff for the background, PixInsight is really great for helping edit your photos. It's got a wild amount of tools. I use it almost all of my images these days. Again, not necessary, but if you want to go that far, by all means. It is quite a bit of a learning curve if you haven't used it. It took me about a month or so to really start using it properly. So let's take a look. I've got some example images. They're not ideal. They're not right out of my camera, but they'll give you an idea of what I would do with some data once I have it. So let's go into Lightroom first. What I'm going to do is get a few images here. I did not take these for clarification, but these will serve perfectly well. So this was out in Utah. So we've got some nice desert foreground. I edited these to show off some light pollution. So one of the things you may want to do is come in here, and this is one reason why Lightroom is so great. You can see it's a pretty faint background. It's got a lot of light pollution in it. So we can start to adjust this a little bit. And this is assuming we're not going to stack anything, just straight images. So let's bring the exposure down a little bit, boost the contrast. To get some of the orange light pollution out, we'll change our temperature a little bit. Take out some of the purple. Again, you can get creative with this. This isn't by any means an exact guide. Maybe I want a little bit less green in here. So now you can see between these two images quite a significant difference in what this looks like. And you can get even crazier. There's a bunch of stuff that this can do, but for our purposes, this is what this will suffice. Now, we want to apply these same settings to everything. So I'm going to hit Control-C to copy, just like you would in a Word document. Then you're going to highlight all of these and paste. So now we've applied those same settings to all three of these images. We would then go to File and Export. And I typically, again, I would use something like TIFF, which is an uncompressed file type. If you're shooting in RAW, you'll probably convert them to TIFF at this point. I like to use 16 bits. That's the highest that Photoshop can typically handle. And we don't want any compression. We want to maintain as much data as possible. And then if you want to keep the original name, you can, but I typically will do a custom name or a date in a file, something along those lines. So then you'd export these files into whatever folder you happen to have. And from here, we'll jump into Photoshop. So with Photoshop, and I've already got one created here, ready to go, we would import those images into Photoshop. So we've got 4 images here. I've got a reference frame or initial frame that I want to start with. And then you can see as I click through these, we have different meteors. So there's 2 at the top. We've got one here in this frame, and another one here. Now, this is where we start to talk about what do we want to do with this data. And most of the images you'll see of meteor showers, you see all of them all at once. So we're going to accomplish that by using what's called a mask. So we'll put this in here as our visible frame, create a mask. The white indicates that everything in this image is visible. We want to see the back. So effectively what we're going to do is we're going to maintain this background and we're just going to add this meteor to it. What that means is we want to invert. So as I inverted it, you can see that this image now is the bottom image, even though this is still visible. And instead of using an eraser or something like that, it's a little bit easier to work with a mask because now we can do a reveal. We can reveal this frame on top of this one. How we're going to do that? We're going to disable the mask. So the mask is still there, but we've effectively disabled it. We're going to zoom in. Zoom in a little bit farther if I can. And then we're going to use our paintbrush. Now, our paintbrush should be a little bit wider than the meteor, and it should be at no hardness. We want soft edges here because we're going to blend whatever the background is with the underlay background. And since the meteors are going to be typically in a straight line, the way to draw a straight line is to click, hold Shift, and click it again. So now, when I disable this, we should see, if I zoom back out, we now see 3 of the meteors. So it's just revealing this one. And then if we want to do more, we'll just do this, repeat the process again. Create our mask, invert, hide the mask, scroll in so we can see what we're looking at. This one's a little bit smaller. They will vary, of course, in length, depending on the angle that it comes in at. And get back to our brush. If you'll notice, I'm painting with a white. Again, the white will reveal, the black will hide with a mask. So we click, shift, click, and reveal the mask again. And now we have 4, and we'll do the third one just for good measure so you can see what the image will look like. So again, we just have the 1 in here. Double click, invert, hide the mask, zoom in. This one's a little bit bigger. This one actually may be more of a satellite flare. It's hard to tell in this image because it's pretty low saturation. And I'll go over a little bit of what this image looks like in relevance to what we've just talked about. But let's reveal this first. So then click, shift, click, and remove the mask. Or reveal the mask, I should say. So now we've got all of the meteors in this. If you want to save it, you can. You can also flatten the image. Now we just got one image here with all of our meteors in it. Now, one of the things that you'll notice about this image that we talked about earlier, it has chromatic aberration and coma. Now, it doesn't have a lot of coma, but it does have a little bit of stretching at the edges. This is a JPEG, so it's a little bit compressed. If this were a raw image, we'd see it a little bit clearer because it wouldn't compress the data. But at the edges, there's definitely a little bit of stretching here. So it's probably, based on this, it's probably a 14 millimeter lens based on the field of view that we have here, somewhere around 14 millimeters. You'll notice that towards the center, though, we don't have nearly as much, but we do see a little bit of movement in this direction, which tells me the person shooting this probably is using just a tripod and doing lots of exposures over time, and then again, just revealing the meteors in the background. So that, for me, would be an acceptable image. I'd go ahead and save it. Like I mentioned, I'm going to be doing more deep sky stuff, so I'm going to take all these individual frames with meteors, overlay them onto my final deep sky image, which will cancel out the meteors in stacking. So I can hopefully see a lot more detail in the background. You can see with an unmodded camera and not stacking, we only see a little faint Milky Way right here. So let's go back to our presentation. So that was how to edit it, and that effectively will give you a image very similar to what we see in the background of this slide, right? These are most likely Perseids based on where Perseus would be. We see Andromeda right there, and we see this little bit of green and pink coming through. And you can see, again, this person did a great job with the foreground. So at that point, we'll open up for questions and answers. So if anybody wants to unmute and ask questions, we'll also go through the Facebook questions if there are any.
Hey, Alex, thanks for such a great talk. I feel like I learned a lot. I had a question for you.
Sure.
So I was wondering if you are imaging, let's say you try to image the entire night just to see how many meteors you can catch. So if I'm imaging the same part of the sky with a tracker all night long, I know that if I keep the same exposure when the moon comes up, the background is going to change a little bit. Would you suggest, is there a way that I could just maintain all the same parameters and just work on it in processing? Or would you suggest taking a break once the moon starts to come out and reevaluating what exposure I'm using? Would you change?
Sure. So it depends on what you're trying to do. So for me, wanting to do the deep sky stuff along with the meteors, I'm going to stop when the moon comes up because it's going to erase all the data in the background. Now, when you're, if you want to continue in through a little bit of the moon, then you can maintain your settings and fix it in post-processing. If the moon is completely up and it's starting to affect the fainter background stars in your image, then you may want to affect it. But really, with the moon being out, the data is just not going to get to your sensor for the faint stuff. So it kind of depends on what you want to do. I would personally kind of just leave it, especially if you have a filter on it or anything like that, because the filter will help a little bit with that moon glow. But yeah, I mean, that's one of the reasons why we don't do a lot of deep sky, especially broadband imaging with the full moon. It's just the data is just not going to be there.
Thank you.
Good question. Absolutely. You could do a video. Keep in mind though, if you're doing a video, you won't be getting as much light in, right? You're going to be taking extremely fast images. So some of the fainter meteors will not show up in your image and they won't show up in your video. Now, if you wanted to do a time lapse, that'd be pretty cool. So if you did a time lapse with, 10-second images over the course of a night, you'd get a little bit more of the faint meteors and still get a video effectively.
What power source are you using out in the field?
Great question. So when I'm at JGAP, I just plug right into the Jupiter bench. that's the best way to do it. I have been out to the Dillon State Park, and I just use my Jeep. I have a DC to AC power inverter. I'll typically plug into that. I did for a long time use a battery, like one of those portable jumpers. My rig at this point has gotten a little bit too powerful for that jumper, so I will typically power everything off of the car. Now, the rig that I showed, that's all battery powered. Other than the ASI Air, the camera's battery powered. The dew strip is battery powered. You can get one of those portable phone chargers to plug right into, as long as it's. I usually get a 5 amp. And if you had a remote shutter, that's battery powered instead to replace the ASI Air with. So you could go completely battery powered with just that stuff. Even the tracker, that SkyGuider Pro, is battery powered. In fact, when I imaged the Antares area of the Milky Way when I was in Hawaii, I had no power at all. So I just drug that out onto a lava field, let it run, and worked great.
Hey, Alex, great presentation. You mentioned dew strips. Do you want to include that as a vital part of your equipment in there? Can you say something?
Yes. When I say really nice to have, I mean, you can definitely get away with not using dew strips. It's just how long do you want to image before your image is completely grayed out, right? And dew strips are great because you get a consistent even heat around it. But I know Brad, he uses hand warmers and is it a sock or pantyhose or something like that? Anything that you can basically tie the hand warmers around your lens with. Those work just as good. But anything to keep the dew off. It's very important for lens health and your images.
A couple questions on our comments on low tech. I've taken some astrophotography, even point and shoots, and there are some that'll go 15 seconds. And in fact, I have an older Canon that you can actually go 15 seconds up 800, 1600. And take some, whether it's meteors, I've gotten some comments that way. But some of them are a little weird, like you'll try a longer exposure. I have a Canon that doesn't let you do that. You go to 15 seconds and it suddenly changes the ISO back to 100 and things like that. So you have to kind of know what your camera will do. And the other thing is, if you can still find it, I used to do this with film all the time. And of course, film has the advantage you can open the exposure forever. And if you can still find 400 ISO film, print film, and you can find somebody to print it, you'll probably have to get the negatives and do your own printing, because the developers don't know what to do with astrophotography when they'll develop it. They'll develop your negatives, but your prints will look terrible. So you'll have to do work on that later. So.
Yep.
There's a question from Greg on the Facebook chat that says, can you video instead of single shooting?
Oh, yeah. I think Brad brought that one up. And just to reiterate for that, if anyone missed it, you can do video, right? You'll see the sky move across, you'll see the brighter ones, but because your shutter speed is so quick with video, you won't be able to get any of the fainter meteors that are coming through the atmosphere. Again, if you want that video look, I would recommend doing a time lapse. For one, you probably don't want a 2-hour, 3-hour long video of, 15 meteors an hour. So doing a time lapse is really great, because you can speed that up. You can get the longer exposure times, and you can still watch the night sky move across without watching it in real time. Just waiting for the lag.
I have another question.
All right.
So if you took a lot of longer exposures to get the deep sky objects to come out, but then say you took some shorter exposure images just to have more images going where you have more meteors, but the exposure times are slightly different, can you still use the same method where you're using masks in Photoshop to pull the meteors out when the exposures are on different scales?
Absolutely. Yeah. So in Photoshop, right, that image could be of anything, right? You're just revealing the image of another image, right? So yeah, you could put a picture of your house in front of there and see meteors in your house if you wanted to, right? Yeah, perfectly fine. Again, that's what I'm planning to do, because when you do a stack, it's going to remove those meteors. In fact, I took a image of the Cone Nebula last winter, and I had no idea that there was actually an asteroid in it until someone posted on the ZWO page and said, "Hey, I found this." I'm like, "Oh, I gotta go back and look at my data," because it's the same day, and sure enough, there was the asteroid. And what I did is I took the stretched final image of the Cone Nebula, and then I used masks to unhide the asteroid in each individual frame, and then created a time lapse of it moving across the cone. So yeah, you definitely changing the exposure time would not affect it at all. So again, great question. The moon will greatly affect your shots, right? Especially depending on where you're pointing in the sky. We're really wide, right? So if your image is going to have the moon passing through it, you're going to get just the moon. And that's to what you mentioned. If that happens, it doesn't matter how long your exposure is, and it doesn't matter what you can do in post-processing, the data will not be there at all. So if the moon ends up in your shot, you're pretty much not going to see anything, because it'll be completely whitewashed. Now, like I said, there are filters out there that can help a little bit, especially since the Perseids will be green and pink. Using a UHC filter or a light pollution filter, that may help bring those colors out a little bit more and erase some of the blue background that the moon will throw in. But yeah, once it gets to a certain elevation in the sky, it's not going to be solvable at that point. That's why, again, I would say probably around, I think it was 1 or 1:30 is when the moon will be up. I'll probably stop imaging myself. Now, with that being said, don't feel like you have to be done, right? Because the Perseids are going to be continuing. You can go night after night, and if you know where you're pointing, you can take multiple nights of meteors and keep adding those meteors to your image. And then if you're using something like plate solving, which is in the ASI Air and APT and stuff like that, not only can you get the additional meteors, but you can also get even more data without much shift in your image.
I have another question from the CAS Facebook. This question is from Gotham, and he's wondering if you could go back to Stellarium and just briefly show how to look up a constellation in Stellarium.
Sure. Let me bring Stellarium up and let me share my screen. So let's get rid of the stuff down here. So all these things down here are kind of how you can see things in the night sky. And then up here is our field of view. So hey, there's a Perseid meteor right there. So in Stellarium, typically when you first install it, you'll probably see something like this. So this turns on your constellations. This puts the names up right next to it. And if you want to see an artist's image over top, that's right next to it. So now you can see you've got the eye of Medusa and Perseus himself, Andromeda, so on and so forth. I don't typically like to use that though because it hides a lot of the background stuff. You can turn the horizon on and off. I really like the azimuth grid because it lets me know, okay, how high is something. It's hard to see right here because I can selected Andromeda. Anything above 30 degrees is really your ideal point. I've been able to image just after 20, but once you're below 20, you can see how between city glow and also the atmosphere gets so dense in this area, you won't be able to see much here. But yeah, I like to use those things the most. Of course, the little galaxy here is for your deep sky objects. Planet will show your planets. Yeah, and you can kind of play with some of these other things. Those are the main ones, though. So yeah, this one turns the constellations on and off.
Could you show where the lens settings were for your image scale?
Sure. Yeah. So it's yep, right up in the right corner, upper right corner.
All right.
So if you select the square, that's the image. The tools lets you change your telescope, and you can have this for eyepieces, lenses, sensors. For some reason, I did have my DSLR in here, and it didn't save it for some reason. It might have Stellarium might have just closed without it being graceful. But like I got my Hyperstar in here. It's great for all-around photography, so you can see how big in your frame is going to be, so you're not futzing with it in the field.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah. Oh, and actually, we can see the moon right here. Yep. Go for it.
Hey, Brad. Brad, sorry to interrupt. You're a little quiet, and the image is showing up on Facebook, but not on Zoom. Just wanted to let you know.
Oh, good information. I see a question in the chat from Marilu. And I'll just repeat this. So when I look through the camera viewfinder, I won't necessarily see what I actually captured because I may not be using the right aperture, timing, or ISO. Is that correct? So the viewfinder, if you're using a DSLR and you've got the little window there for viewfinding, you're actually just seeing what's right before the sensor. There's a prism in there that pushes it up into that viewfinder. If you have a DSLR with a LCD or an LED screen, that will show you not just what you're seeing with the live view, it'll also show you when you take an image, what your image will look like with your shutter speed, ISO, aperture, things like that. And I use that a lot with my DSLR. I'll take a long image. I'll see, okay, is that too long? Am I getting star trails? I'll try to see how much the gain is. Gain is kind of just from experience. I wouldn't go much over 3200. I try to shoot around 1600 if possible. And the aperture is another one of those. If you take a long image, you can kind of zoom in using the buttons to see, are you getting any chromatic aberration or coma on the edges of your image? So you can, if you're using a digital viewfinder on most newer cameras, you can certainly play with those and see what you got. Like I said, the ISO is the main one. It's going to be hard to see because the image that your camera is going to show you is what it thinks it's supposed to be stretched at. So the main things that you'll be looking for are things that are actually going to be impacting the signal more so than the noise, right? But good question. If you, for framing, you typically won't be using your viewfinder. You'll, or at least a image. You'll typically use the live view or the viewfinder itself to look at the stars in the rough area where you want it to be. And then you can finally start taking your images and then see if you're using the right aperture or shutter speed, right? So good question. And it's kind of a yes or no, depending on your viewfinder.
Alex, another question from the JGAP feed. Do you have any recommendations of a lens that would be good for Canon?
Like I said, I use the Rokinon. They make a Nikon version and a Canon version. Make sure you get the right one, because even within Canon, there are two types of lens mounts. The EOS, I think, is the one for your APS Canon Rebel ones. I have a Rokinon right here. This is not my 14, but this is just screws onto a Canon camera, and this is a, it tells me, it might not tell me on this particular lens. It does not, but yeah, so I would say get 15 millimeter. You can typically pick up for 150, maybe 200 bucks. So it's actually a really good, cheap lens. Highly recommend it. And like I said, they make it for Canon, all types of Canons and the Nikons.
Alex, I have a question. You were talking about, of course, finding the darkest site possible, but for someone who might be in a near suburb that has some light pollution, any recommendations on what to do to optimize, how long to go or not to go if you're
absolutely
like you know, say you're 8 miles from downtown or somewhere like that, or 5 miles down. So and you have a good clear night. I'm assuming you have a nice clear night too.
Right, because that's the other thing is haze will be even more noticeable when you're in under the light dome. So if you're in the downtown Columbus, there's not much you'll be able to do. You're only going to, it's kind of like the moon at that point. You're only going to see the brightest ones. It's going to be difficult. Now in I live here in Delaware, so in my backyard I'm at about a 5 or 6 Bortle class, getting worse every day it seems. But I can get away with a moonless night and pointing away from Delaware with a city light pollution filter or a UHC filter. So both those things have a dip in the visible light spectrum around where sodium vapor typically is. And it will focus more on the green, blue, and blue side, as well as the more red hydrogen alpha areas. So that's really the best thing you can do. Like I said, city light pollution filter is going to be a little bit more gentler, probably better for meteors. But the UHC filter is going to be a little bit more aggressive. So you'll still see it, but it'll definitely be a little bit harder to see some of those colors come out.
Okay, thanks.
I have another question via text message from
All
a
right.
member. So how do you make sure that your images are in focus before you start your intervalometer?
Oh, yeah, big question.
Great question. Great question. That should have been a slide. So the best thing to do, especially if you at this focal length, because it's so wide, the best thing to do is find a very bright star, something like Vega. Deneb is pretty good in that area. You could try like Navi and Cassiopeia, but you want to find the brightest star you possibly can. You could even do Jupiter if you wanted, and you want to zoom in and play with your focus until it's as small as possible. If you're shooting with a little bit longer focal length, you can get what's called a Batinoff mask. You can get them as small as 4 inches, and it'll stick on the end of the lens, and it creates diffraction spikes in a X pattern. And there will be one diffraction spike in the middle, and when that middle diffraction spike is right at the center of the X, you're in focus. I've tried this on a 14 millimeter, and it's extremely difficult to see because the stars are so small. But I would say, like I said, the best thing to do, find a bright star, get it to where you're as close as you can to get it the smallest, and you should be good. Again, when you're wide like this, the details are not going to be quite as vital as if you were shooting at very long focal lengths.
True.
All right, I think this is the point where I ask for last call for questions. Does anyone else have any more questions? We'll wait around for a little bit to see if any questions appear on Facebook. But this was an excellent talk. Thank you, Alex. I learned a lot.
Yeah, thanks, no problem.
Alex, where are you going to go to watch the meteor shower this year? Do you have plans yet?
So I was thinking about going to JGAP. That's my go-to spot now because it's got a nice the plaza's nice, so I don't have to worry about leveling too much, and it's got power, always a good plus, and it's just got it's up above the trees enough. I went out to Dillon when JGAP was closed, and it wasn't bad, but I didn't get a great view of some of the lower objects because there's just a lot of trees. That's the downside of Ohio, especially when you try to get out into the country. Most of that's farmland, so it's owned by people. And if you go the other direction into the state parks, there's just a lot of trees you got to deal with.
All right. I don't see any more questions. Before we end the live feed on Facebook, I just wanted to remind members to look for an email for our meeting next week on Zoom, and also remind anyone interested in going, any members that are interested in going to our Dark Sky site to send an email to Mark Peter if you want to watch the Perseid shower. So, all right. I think we'll end the live feed on Facebook now. Thank you, Alex.
Thank you.